In this video I'm going to quickly run through configuring the modern and mobile apps OData application that comes as part of the 2013 and 2015 CRM SDK samples for authentication against Windows Azure Active Directory rather than against your on-premise IFD deployment. So this is directly from the SDK, the help pages. You'll see that this is the application itself. The source code is available within the sample code folder under here, and what we've got is a copy of this here, which is essentially unchanged. There's a couple of bits and pieces that I've added extra, but just for the purposes of running through the demo. So when you first open this up, you'll see that what you've got are a couple of, specifically 3 values that you need to set. These are the client ID, CRM service URL, and the OAuth URL. Now, depending on whether you're configuring for Azure or for IFD, these will be slightly different. But as we're doing Azure, what I'm going to do is run through how you can configure these, how you can set up your application within Azure Active Directory so that the user can run this application. They'll be authenticated against Azure Active Directory, and then their credentials will then be used by the OData, by the application, to access the OData service directly in CRM Online. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do, you'll see that we've got, as I said, these 3 values: client, CRM service URL, and OAuth URL. Now, I've actually got some of these already pre-configured down here, but the client URL I'll come back to in a second because we need to obtain that from the Azure portal. But so our CRM service URL, essentially all that is the base URL to your CRM Online instance. So in this case, I'm running an 30-day trial, and that 30-day trial is against an organisation called OAuth2. So obviously the full URL to that website is simply OAuth2 crm4.dynamics.com. So if we actually go to that URL, we'll see. So I can log in successfully to Dynamics CRM. I'm not actually going to do it now because it's fairly pointless. Okay. The next one is OAuth URL. So this is the secure token service URL for Windows Live authentication, or Windows Live authentication, Azure Active Directory authentication, Office 365 authentication. It comes under many guises, but ultimately it's all the same. What you have to do is craft this URL, which the base for any organisation, anyone trying to use single sign-on via Azure Active Directory, the base URL is https loginwindows.net, and then what denotes your specific installation is the latter piece of the URI here, which is, in my case, octonodemo.onmicrosoft.com. Now, what that actually represents is the URI for the Azure tenant, the Azure Active Directory tenant for CRM Online. What happens now is whenever you create a CRM Online account, whether that's a trial or obviously you take that forward and turn that into a production installation, your authentication is now done via an Azure Active Directory tenant. Typically, you won't really care about that because most of the user management was probably done via the CRM portal itself, or specifically from the Office 365 portal where you'll go and add users. But whenever you're adding a user, what it's actually doing under the hood is adding that user into an Azure Active Directory, and this is the tenant for that. So in my case, because as you can see clearly, it takes your organisation name and then it's .onmicrosoft.com. So that's our auth URL. That's where the user will be redirected for authentication for this application. And then finally, what we've got is a GUID, which is the client ID. Now that client ID is the way that Azure Active Directory uniquely identifies our application in this case being our ModernODataApp. So that GUID is actually now defunct because I've removed it. I'm using a different version. So what we'll do now is I'll go into the Azure portal and we'll configure Active Directory so that it's now aware of our application, our ModernODataApp. I've got 3 Azure Active Directories in my portal. The one that we're going to be using is this one here, Octono, which is the one that's actually directly linked to my CRM Online trial. And I know this by virtue of the fact that there's my Dynamics CRM. So that's an application that's already pre-registered in this Azure Active Directory. This is all set up at the point where you create your trial. This is actually the Active Directory that gets created under the hood. Now I've actually linked this Azure Active Directory to a different Azure portal account. Otherwise you'd have to go through and set up a trial for yourself. I'll do another video that details how to do that. It's a little bit, it's not convoluted, but you have to sort of log in on one portal, log out on another. But all I've done is just linked it to this Azure account. You don't need to worry about it for the purposes of what we're demonstrating here today. So what we need to do, as I said, is we need to make our Azure Active Directory tenant aware of our application. So what we can do here is we can add the application. We add an application my organisation is developing, which is what we are doing. Give it a name, which we'll call ModernODataApp. And it's a native client application rather than a web application. And the redirect URI. Now for now, we're just going to put in here HTTP localhost. It will fail with just that, but for now that just needs to be a valid URI, and I'll show you what we're going to do with that in a moment. Okay, so we've now added a record for our application into this Azure Active Directory. So the Azure Active Directory is now going to, it will allow us to authenticate users via our application. So if we look here at configure, the first thing you'll notice here is that we've now got this client ID. So if we take a copy of that, if you remember, we need to drop that into the code here. So that's the client ID that I'd previously just deleted. It's one of those 3 values that we need to configure. So if we set that, and then we save the application. Now, if you remember when I was just setting this up, I was talking about the redirect URI and how we're actually going to have to change that. Now that redirect URI, for the purposes of ModernODataApps, has to be the SID for the Windows application. Now, I'm not much of a Windows Store app developer, so I'm not too much of an expert on this. I've actually had a look around within the properties of the application to see whether that information is available to me. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be. So there's no way that I seem to be able to get access to that URI. But so what I do is, although I know that this is now going to fail, if we spin up the application, now you'll see I put a breakpoint here on this redirect URL. What this call to the Web Authentication Broker is actually going to do is get that URI for us, which we need to put in here for the redirect. The redirect, if it's a web app, all that is once the authentication process is completed, where do you want the user to be sent back to? So in a web app, obviously they ordinarily go off to another application like their Facebook's, or in this case, obviously Windows Live, log in, and then they're redirected back to the application that they're trying to authenticate into. But obviously, because this is a Windows 8 application, there isn't really that notion of redirection, but it does need this redirect URI anyway. So if we bounce over that, you'll now see that the value that we've now got stored in this variable here, I've already got one there. So that's our redirect URI, which actually that denotes the full SID for the application. So I think that's just the unique identifier for it if it was published to the Windows Store. So I'll run this now, and I'll actually just show you how the error actually manifests itself. So what you could also do, you don't actually have to stop in the breakpoint, but you can see the actual error that you're also getting is the reply address does not match the reply address configured for the application. So actually the reply address that the application thinks it should be sending back to, which is the value that we just copied from that variable. So in theory, you could just spin it up and just capture it from here if you want. Doesn't match the reply address configured. And the reason why it doesn't match what's configured is because at the moment all we've got it set up for is just localhost. So if I set that now to there and then save, so now we've told it what our redirect URI is. If I now run up the application, what you'll see is that we're now prompted for login because it's happy to hand off to the secure token service, log us in, and then redirect back to the application. Interestingly, although this is the Windows Store app, obviously this is we're actually hitting a live web page here for Windows Live, and it's if I just bounce back out of this, it's this web authentication broker that actually manages the surfacing of that web page within our application. Now, if you want to, there's a little bit more information about how all of that works on this page here. I'll link this in the notes of the video so that you can take a look if you want, but suffice to say that that all now works for us, but we've got one more step that we need to do here before this is actually going to work, and I'll show you because this won't actually now log us in. So if I've got a user within my Azure Active Directory that also could be, this is a valid CRM user that I'm working with now. So oops. Okay, and now what you'll see is essentially that we've got an access denied, and the client application has requested access to HTTPS. This is access to my CRM Online. The request has failed because the client has not specified this resource and it's required a resource access list. Great, okay. So required resource access lists, I've not seen those or anything like that before. Well, this was certainly the thinking that I was going through when I was initially setting this up. What we need to do is, coming back to Azure Active Directory, we've told the Active Directory about our application. So our application is now being authenticated within that Azure Active Directory tenant, but we haven't actually given the application permission to go off and talk to our CRM installation. So what we need to do down here is give permission to this application to other applications within our tenant. In this instance, that other application is, of course, Dynamics CRM Online. So if we add, so that's added, and then we just need to access CRM Online as organisation users, check the box, and save. Okay, and now what we've got is our ModernODataApp is known to the Azure Active Directory tenant that authenticates users into Dynamics CRM Online, and the application has been given permission to talk to Dynamics CRM Online. So if we come back to our app, and we run that one more time, log in as Bob. And you'll see that we're now within the application, and if we look at accounts, those accounts are now going to be pulled from CRM Online, our CRM Online installation. And most importantly, those accounts are being pulled under the context of Bob's account. So if Bob doesn't have permissions to certain accounts within here, he won't see them in just the way that you would expect. So I hope that that's been useful. So when I first ran up this application, I was a little bit confused by what needed to be set for all of these values. But in the work that I've been doing recently around Azure integration, I've figured all this stuff out, and I thought it would be quite useful just to put a video out really to share with others. So that's it. Thank you.